They told you the Dreadmoores were just another forgotten name in the brittle pages of county records. Respectable merchants, quiet benefactors, pillars of their church. That was the lie. The truth was never meant to survive, but it did, buried in a locked drawer of the state archives, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a black ribbon. It is not a story you stumble into. It is a trap you fall into. And the moment you hear it, you will never unhear it. You will feel it in the marrow. You will suspect every smile, every handshake, every sermon you've ever trusted. Because the Dreadmoores were not simply evil. They were architects of a system that still exists, disguised, thriving, watching you. Before we descend, hear me. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to tell you will take us into rooms that history swore it had burned to ash. This channel, DeadScroll, exists to tear the veil, to drag the forbidden into the light. If you think you can walk away from this, you are wrong. Once you know, you belong. The year was 1814, on the western edge of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, a place of rolling fog and timber-thick hills, where families built homes of stone and oak to withstand winters that split the earth. The Dreadmoore estate stood apart from the rest. 3 stories of black limestone, its windows narrow and watchful, its chimneys always exhaling the slow breath of unseen fires. At night, the lamps in its upper rooms burned long after every other house in the township went dark. No one knew exactly when the family had arrived. The earliest land records simply note, transfer to J. Dreadmoore, 1796, but no one remembered witnessing the sale. They appeared suddenly, Jeremiah, tall and gaunt, with eyes like cold iron filings, and his wife, Lucinda, whose beauty was described as unnerving rather than charming. They attended church only twice a year, yet the minister visited them monthly. Goods from their estate traveled east in heavy wagons, covered in canvas, guarded by hired men who spoke no English. There were whispers, of course, wagons seen at night, faint music drifting from the upper floors, strange herbs burning in the orchard. But in those days, whispers were a kind of currency, dangerous to spend, fatal to hoard. And so the township let the Dreadmoores be. That was their first mistake. The Dreadmoore estate was not a home in the common sense. It was a fortress of ritual. Those who worked the ground spoke of rules that could not be broken. Never cross the threshold of the east wing. Never speak to Lucinda without being addressed first, and never, under any circumstances, remain on the property after sundown. Wages were high, higher than any farm or mill in the county, but turnover was constant. People left without notice, without even returning for their final pay. Jeremiah conducted himself like a man accustomed to obedience. His voice was low, slow, and deliberate, every word calculated. He could spend an entire conversation without revealing a single fact about himself. The few who attempted casual inquiries about his origins, his business, his travels, described an unsettling shift in his demeanor, as if a door had slammed shut behind his eyes. Lucinda, on the other hand, was rarely seen in daylight. She moved through the estate like a phantom, veiled in black lace, her footsteps somehow inaudible on stone floors. A midwife once claimed that when Lucinda fixed her gaze upon her, she felt as if her thoughts were being lifted from her mind, sifted through, and placed back altered. She never returned to the estate again. The true dread began in the winter of 1816. Heavy snows had cut off the township for nearly a month, and in that time, 3 local children vanished. Each disappearance occurred on a Sunday night, each family living within a mile of the Dreadmoore property. There was no sign of forced entry, no tracks in the snow, no evidence the children had left their homes by any natural means. But always, on the morning after, a thin plume of smoke rose from the Dreadmoore chimneys, carrying with it a scent unlike wood or coal, a bitter, metallic tang that clung to the air for days. One man, Elias Caro, claimed he followed that smoke to its source, hiding in the tree-line until dusk. Through a narrow, unshuttered window, he swore he saw Jeremiah bent over a long table, the flicker of candlelight glinting off something wet. Lucinda stood behind him, holding a silver bowl as though an offering. The next day, Elias packed his family and left the county without a word. His property was found abandoned, fires still burning in the hearth. He was never seen again. By spring, the Dreadmoores had woven themselves deeper into the fabric of Allegheny County, not through friendship, but through obligation. Jeremiah began extending quiet loans to struggling farmers, his terms curiously generous, no interest, no deadlines. But the debt was never settled with coin. Months later, those same families would be seen delivering crates, barrels, or sacks to the estate under cover of night. Whatever passed between debtor and creditor was never discussed, but the look in the farmer's eyes afterward told a single, silent truth. Repayment came at a cost far greater than money. The local church, too, began to change. The minister, Reverend Halloway, once a plain-spoken man with weathered hands and a steady voice, started speaking of hidden blessings and gifts not meant for every eye. His sermons grew veiled, almost coded, as if they were intended for only a select few in the pews. Parishioners noticed that after each of these strange sermons, Jeremiah would linger in the vestry with the Reverend for hours, the two emerging with expressions carved from stone. Then came the incident of the well. In June of 1817, a drought struck the township. Wells across the valley ran dry, all except the one on Dreadmoore land. Farmers begged Jeremiah to share the water. He agreed, but only if they came themselves, alone, after dark. Those who did returned pale, withdrawn, and tight-lipped. The water, they said, was cold even in the heat, with a taste faintly metallic, like blood diluted in iron. Within weeks, strange occurrences spread among those who had drunk from it. Vivid dreams of candlelit rooms, voices whispering in forgotten languages, and an unshakable compulsion to walk toward the Dreadmoore estate at night. One woman, Ruth Penman, awoke to find herself standing barefoot at the edge of the Dreadmoore orchard, unable to remember leaving her bed. The next night, she was found again, this time inside the outer garden wall. By the third night, she vanished entirely. Her husband, frantic, confronted Jeremiah. The following Sunday, the Reverend announced from the pulpit that Ruth had answered a higher calling and would not be returning. No one questioned it, but behind closed doors, suspicion festered. Old men in taverns muttered of bargains sealed in the east wing, of Lucinda's shadow moving against candlelight, not in sync with her own body. And somewhere in that black limestone fortress, the Dreadmoores were keeping something, not for themselves, but for someone else. The first written accusation against the Dreadmoores came not from a neighbor, but from a man who had never even set foot on their land. His name was Dr. Aldrich Vaughan, a physician from Pittsburgh who had been called to examine a curious delivery sent to the city's cathedral in early autumn of 1817. It was a reliquary, a gilded, glass-fronted case containing what appeared to be a saint's finger, perfectly preserved. The accompanying letter, and signed, claimed it had been brought from a private collection of great sanctity and gifted to the church for the strengthening of faith. Dr. Vaughan, however, had spent years studying forensic anatomy. What struck him first was not the craftsmanship of the reliquary, but the freshness of the tissue. The preservation was crude, salts, herbs, and resin, and bore none of the hallmarks of Old World relics. In short, it was recent, very recent. The age, he estimated, could be measured in weeks, not centuries. When he pressed the cathedral staff for the source of the artifact, they admitted, reluctantly, that it had arrived in a wooden crate marked with the Dreadmoore seal, a crescent moon pierced by an arrow. Vaughan reported his findings to the local magistrate, but the report never made it to court. The magistrate, as it turned out, was one of Jeremiah Dreadmoore's debtors. Still, the physician's curiosity did not fade. Within months, he began collecting testimonies from Allegheny County, stories of missing farmhands, of church donations that arrived in heavy boxes, of a minister whose eyes seemed darker each season. Vaughan's private notes reveal a dawning horror, that the Dreadmoores were not just trading in relics, but creating them. And that creation, he suspected, required raw material only the living could provide. Then, on the night of December 3rd, 1817, a letter arrived at Vaughan's home. No seal, no signature, only a single line in an elegant, spidery hand. You are digging in soil that has swallowed better men than you. From that day forward, Dr. Vaughn was watched. Strangers lingered near his practice. His mail was tampered with, and twice he awoke to find muddy footprints in his hallway, prints that led to his bedroom door and stopped there. By February, he closed his practice and fled Pittsburgh entirely. His last known whereabouts were a boarding house in Baltimore. 1 month later, the boarding house keeper found his room empty, his trunk untouched, his bed unslept in. The trunk contained only 3 items: a black notebook, a sealed reliquary, and a scrap of paper bearing the words, "Allegheny owes a debt." If you had been brave or foolish enough to step beyond the wrought iron gates of the Dreadmoore estate in 1818, you would have noticed something strange about its construction. The house was larger inside than it appeared from the road. Hall seemed to stretch just a little farther than the outside walls could possibly allow. Staircases doubled back on themselves in ways that left visitors disoriented, as if the geometry of the place obeyed a different set of rules. Most unnerving of all was the east wing. The entrance to it was not barred nor guarded. It was simply avoided. Servants spoke of hearing faint chanting from behind its walls, rhythmic and low, carrying the metallic scent of the well water. Others swore that the door handle was always cold to the touch, no matter the season, as if it connected not to a room, but to an open night. One laborer, Caleb Whitlock, claimed to have seen the east wing from the inside. According to his whispered account in the tavern weeks later, the hall there was lined with tall, narrow niches. In each niche stood a figure draped in black cloth, their outlines unmistakably human. Caleb swore he saw the fabric move, breathing, shifting, as if the figures were alive beneath their shrouds. Before he could investigate, Lucinda appeared at the far end of the corridor, her face obscured by a veil. She spoke a single word he did not understand, and the air in the hall became suddenly heavy, choking. The next thing he remembered, he was waking in his own bed, a week later, with a jagged scar running along his ribs. After that, Caleb left the county and refused to speak of it again. But others began to notice strange marks appearing on their bodies, small, deliberate incisions, arranged in shapes that meant nothing to them, but might have meant everything to the Dreadmoores. And the debtors? They began disappearing entirely. Not in the way a man flees a bad bargain, but as if they had been collected. Families awoke to find their doors still locked from within, the hearth still warm, but a father or mother gone without a trace. In their place, sometimes, would be a package, a sealed jar, filled with clear liquid, inside which floated a pale object that might have been a knuckle or the tip of a tongue. By midsummer, the town had stopped whispering about the Dreadmoores. It had started praying for them, not for their safety, for their mercy. The supernatural element of the Dreadmoores' influence didn't announce itself with lightning or apparitions. It seeped in like rot in the beams of a house, slow, silent, and irreversible. By the autumn of 1818, those who had dealings with the family began to experience a peculiar phenomenon: shared dreams. Farmers, millers, even the postmaster all reported seeing the same vision during sleep. It always began with the sound of dripping water in a pitch-black room. Then, a faint glow would appear, revealing a long banquet table draped in black cloth. Seated at the head was Jeremiah Dreadmoore, but his face was obscured, as though a shadow were cast across it despite the glow. At the far end, Lucinda poured from a silver pitcher into a goblet, the liquid dark and thick. In the dream, she would raise the goblet and say, "Drink, and be remembered." Those who refused would wake with a violent nosebleed and an overwhelming sense of dread. Those who accepted found themselves waking hours, or days, later, with no memory of what they'd done in the waking world. One man, Thomas Wren, kept a diary of these lost periods. His entries grew fragmented, almost illegible, until they stopped altogether in mid-sentence. They know when you see, they know. 3 days later, Thomas was found drowned in his own well, though the water inside measured barely 4 feet deep. His hands were clasped neatly over his chest, and in one was a folded scrap of paper. Written in an ornate, spidery hand were the words, "The debt is paid." By winter, the shared dreams spread beyond the debtors. Strangers passing through Allegheny would wake in their inns with the taste of iron on their tongues and a clear memory of the banquet table. Some never left town. Some left immediately, abandoning possessions and family without explanation. The Reverend's sermons shifted further, his voice now carrying a rhythm like a chant. He began ending each service with the same strange benediction. "May your shadow be long, and your debt eternal." It was during this period that the first records of the gathering nights appeared, occasions when the lamps in the east wing blazed until dawn, the chimneys poured black smoke, and the orchard filled with a low, unearthly hum that could be felt through the ground. Those who heard it too closely were never quite themselves again. The gathering nights were never announced. They were felt. The first sign was always the air. Even in the depth of winter, the wind would grow warm near the Dreadmoore grounds, carrying that same metallic tang as the well water. Dogs howled and strained at their chains, their eyes rolling white. Horses refused to cross the road that bordered the estate. And from somewhere deep within the east wing, a sound began, low at first, then rising in waves. It was not music, not exactly. It had the cadence of human voices, but the resonance of something far larger, as though the house itself were breathing in unison with the chant. On those nights, shapes moved in the orchard. Witnesses claimed they were cloaked figures, each carrying a lantern that cast no light beyond a few feet, as if the glow itself were reluctant to leave its source. They moved in deliberate circles, tracing patterns invisible to the eye but obvious to the earth. Afterward, the grass inside those rings would grow black and brittle, never to return. The true ceremony, however, took place inside the east wing. No outsider had ever seen it and returned whole, except one. In the late winter of 1819, a boy named Samuel Hale, 12 years old, son of a debtor, vanished from his home during a gathering night. His father searched frantically, following what he swore were his son's footprints through the snow, straight to the iron gates of the estate. There the trail ended. 3 days later, Samuel stumbled into the family's barn at dawn. He was barefoot, his nightshirt torn, his skin cold as river stone. His father carried him inside, but the boy would not speak. Not for a day, not for a week. Then, one night, Samuel rose from bed and, without preamble, said, "There's more of the house underground." Pressed for details, he described a vast hall beneath the east wing, its walls lined with shelves of glass vessels. Inside each vessel floated a pale, shifting light, hundreds of them, pulsing faintly, each whispering in a voice too quiet to make out. At the far end of the hall was a black door carved with the crescent moon and arrow of the Dreadmoore seal. Lucinda stood before it, holding the silver bowl, and Jeremiah was knocking, not on the door itself, but on the space just above it, as though calling to something that waited beyond. The boy would say no more after that. His father claimed that, over the following months, Samuel's reflection began to behave oddly, delayed movements, a smile when his face was still. By midsummer, the boy disappeared again, this time without footprints, and was never seen. From then on, it was whispered that the gathering nights were not for the living at all. They were for those in the jars. The first credible account of the contents came from an unlikely source, a thief. In the spring of 1820, a man known only as Rake tried his luck with the Dreadmoore estate. He'd heard the usual tales, but greed has a way of muffling fear. His target was not the house itself, but the cellar, rumored to contain imported wines worth a fortune. Rake never made it to the wine. According to the testimony he gave weeks later in a tavern in Wheeling, before vanishing entirely the next morning, the cellar stairs led not to barrels, but to a narrow stone passage. The walls grew damp, the air warmer, until the corridor opened into a cavern lit by a sickly blue glow. It came from the jars, hundreds of them, arranged on shelves that reached higher than he could see. The vessels were not filled with liquid, as he first thought, but with a dense, shifting mist that coiled and recoiled like something alive. At times, a pale face would emerge from the fog, eyes wide, mouth moving soundlessly, before melting back into the haze. He swore he recognized one of them, a blacksmith who'd disappeared 2 winters earlier, debtor to Jeremiah. But it was the sound that broke him. The jars whispered, not in unison, not to him directly, but to each other. Fragments of memory, prayers, curses, desperate bargains. They bled together into a constant murmur. And beneath it, something deeper, a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Rake turned to flee, but his lantern flickered out. In the darkness, a woman's voice spoke behind him, calm, amused, and impossibly close. You've already been bottled, dear. You just don't know it yet. He woke in the woods miles from the estate, his clothes damp, his left hand wrapped in linen. When he unwound it, he found a small glass bead stitched into his palm. Inside it swirled the same blue mist he'd seen in the cavern. Over the next week, it grew fainter until disappearing entirely, and with it, he claimed, went all memory of his mother's face. By summer, whispers spread. The lights in the jars were debts made flesh, memories, pieces of the self, harvested and preserved until the Dreadmoores decided to spend them. The jars were not trophies. They were currency. By late 1820, the Dreadmoores' influence reached far beyond Allegheny County. Strangers in fine coats and heavy cloaks began arriving under cover of night, their carriages marked only with a small crescent and arrow seal. They stayed no more than a few hours, but always left heavier than they'd come, not with gold or silver, but with 1 or 2 of the glass vessels, cradled like holy relics. Samuel Hale's father, still bitter and broken, swore he once spied on such an exchange from the tree line. In the moonlight, he saw Jeremiah hand a jar to a tall, skeletal man whose shadow seemed to bend in the wrong direction. The man pressed something into Jeremiah's hand, not an object, but a gesture, as though passing him air. Jeremiah inhaled it deeply, and for a moment his skin tightened, the lines in his face smoothing, his hair darkening to the color of wet coal. The effect lasted only seconds, but Samuel's father swore the change was real. These trades became known in whispers as settlements. They were the reason the jars never gathered dust. When the Dreadmoores spent one, something happened, something subtle but permanent. A woman in Pittsburgh, for example, was said to have woken one morning with the sudden ability to speak 5 languages she had never learned. A mill burned in Wheeling without leaving a single scorch mark on the ground. A child survived a fall from a 3rd-story window, but his shadow never moved in time with his body again. It was never clear what the Dreadmoores themselves received in these bargains, but the effects in the county grew stranger. Storms that halted at the edge of the estate, owls gathering in the orchard in hundreds, silent and unblinking. The sound of knocking, 3 slow raps, coming from under the ground whenever someone in town died. By the winter of 1821, one thing was certain. The Dreadmoores were not amassing wealth or power in any earthly sense. They were collecting something far rarer and spending it on causes no one could name. And somewhere, beyond the black door Samuel Hale had seen, was the true recipient of every debt paid. The jars were not trophies. They were currency. By late 1820, the Dreadmoores' influence reached far beyond Allegheny County. Strangers in fine coats and heavy cloaks began arriving under cover of night, their carriages marked only with a small crescent and arrow seal. They stayed no more than a few hours, but always left heavier than they'd come, not with gold or silver, but with 1 or 2 of the glass vessels, cradled like holy relics. Samuel Hale's father, still bitter and broken, swore he once spied on such an exchange from the tree line. In the moonlight, he saw Jeremiah hand a jar to a tall, skeletal man whose shadow seemed to bend in the wrong direction. The man pressed something into Jeremiah's hand, not an object, but a gesture, as though passing him air. Jeremiah inhaled it deeply, and for a moment his skin tightened, the lines in his face smoothing, his hair darkening to the color of wet coal. The effect lasted only seconds, but Samuel's father swore the change was real. These trades became known in whispers as settlements. They were the reason the jars never gathered dust. When the Dreadmoores spent one, something happened, something subtle but permanent. A woman in Pittsburgh, for example, was said to have woken one morning with the sudden ability to speak 5 languages she had never learned. A mill burned in Wheeling without leaving a single scorch mark on the ground. A child survived a fall from a 3rd-story window, but his shadow never moved in time with his body again. It was never clear what the Dreadmoores themselves received in these bargains, but the effects in the county grew stranger. Storms that halted at the edge of the estate, owls gathering in the orchard in hundreds, silent and unblinking. The sound of knocking, 3 slow raps, coming from under the ground whenever someone in town died. By the winter of 1821, one thing was certain. The Dreadmoores were not amassing wealth or power in any earthly sense. They were collecting something far rarer and spending it on causes no one could name. And somewhere, beyond the black door Samuel Hale had seen, was the true recipient of every debt paid. In the spring of 1822, the East Wing caught fire. At least, that was what the sheriff's report claimed. Several townsfolk swore they saw flames in the high windows, a furious orange light flickering against the clouds. But no smoke followed, and by morning, the house stood untouched. No scorch marks, no scent of ash. The only casualty was Reverend Alcott. He was found at the edge of the orchard, his cassock torn, his fingernails worn down to the quick. His eyes were wide open, pupils blown, mouth frozen mid-prayer. In his pocket was a scrap of black paper, heavy and smooth like lacquered wood. On it was a single white crescent, bisected by a downward-pointing arrow. 2 days later, the Dreadmoores boarded up the East Wing entirely. That might have been the end of it, until Elias Booker, the estate's groundskeeper, disappeared and then returned 3 nights later in a state so fragile it bordered on madness. The only thing he would say, over and over, was, "It's not a door. It's a mouth. Press for more." He described descending into the underground hall Samuel had seen. This time, however, the black door stood open. Beyond it was no room, just an impossible expanse of dark, as if the earth had been hollowed out. And in that dark hung a shape so large and close that he could not see its edges. Its surface moved like muscle beneath skin, and from somewhere deep within came the rhythmic sound of breathing. He swore he saw the jars being lowered into it, cradled in coils of something pale and slick, disappearing into the shadows as though swallowed. In return, the thing would exhale, and the air that spilled into the hall smelled of ripe fruit, salt water, and blood. When asked what it looked like, Elias shook his head violently. "You can't look at all of it," he said. "Your eyes aren't allowed." He died within the week, having refused food, sleep, and light. At his burial, the gravedigger found that his coffin was inexplicably warm to the touch. After that, the gathering nights became rarer. But when they came, the earth itself seemed to lean toward the East Wing. It was Matthew Corbin, a failed bookkeeper and worse drunk, who pieced the pattern together. He'd been hired by a creditor in Baltimore to trace the estate's debt records, work no local would touch. Over 6 weeks, Corbin combed through ledgers in the county archives, old court documents, and, most valuably, an oilskin folio he claimed to have borrowed from Jeremiah Dreadmoore's study during a short-lived job as an assistant. What he found was this: every debtor to the Dreadmoores had a number assigned beside their name. Never more than 3 digits, never 0. That number would decrease slowly over months, sometimes years, until it reached 0. Within a week, that debtor would vanish. Corbin noticed something else. The numbers were not amounts of money, nor weights, nor measures of grain or livestock. They were days. Specifically, the days between collections, periods during which a portion of the debtor's memory was taken. The Dreadmoores were stripping them in installments, like payment plans. The memories were not random. The folio listed them with chilling precision. First kiss, smell of mother's bread, fear of drowning, sound of the word mercy. Each collection left the debtor a little more hollow, a little less themselves, until nothing familiar remained. The jars in the underground hall, Corbin realized, were not mere vessels of light. They were accounting. Each one held a soul's most essential moments, stitched together until it became a coherent self. When the last jar for a person was full, their body became an empty thing, and that was when the Dreadmoores delivered it through the black door. As to why, Corbin's folio had one final column, a sigil beside each name, corresponding to a figure he could not identify. All were slightly different, but each had the same root design, the crescent and arrow, followed by what looked like a tally mark. Some names had one tally, some had dozens. He took the folio to a friend in Philadelphia who studied esoteric commerce. The man took one look and told him, pale-faced, "Those aren't tallies. They're feedings." The implication was clear. Whatever lived behind the door wasn't just eating the contents of the jars. It was keeping track, like a careful landlord ensuring rent was paid on time. Corbin fled west the next morning. He made it as far as Wheeling before his coach stopped for the night. Witnesses swore he went to bed after a heavy meal and a bottle of whiskey, but when they came for him in the morning, his bed was empty. The only thing left was the folio, every page wiped clean as though it had never been written in. The first crack came in the summer of 1823. 4 generations. Every collection had been precise, clean extractions, perfectly cataloged jars. But that July, a debt went wrong. The debtor was Ruth Vanner, a seamstress from Braddock. By all accounts, she owed only 20 days. On the night of the collection, neighbors saw the pale lanterns of the orchard procession moving in silence toward the east wing. But sometime before dawn, the procession staggered. The lights swayed erratically, some vanishing entirely before reaching the wing's boarded doors. In the morning, Ruth was found wandering the fields 2 miles from her home. She was barefoot, her hands streaked with soil up to the elbows. When spoken to, she answered in a language no one could place, fluid and melodic, but with a rhythm that set teeth on edge. Her eyes, witnesses said, seemed to focus on something behind the person she was speaking to. 3 days later, she began to change. The skin along her jaw and collarbone took on the faint shimmer of fish scales. She stopped blinking. At night, her husband awoke to find her standing in the doorway, listening to something only she could hear. Most tellingly, people who came near her began to lose small, untraceable pieces of themselves, the knowledge of a childhood friend's name, the memory of their own handwriting, the taste of cinnamon. These losses didn't return. By August, the Dreadmoores themselves intervened. Jeremiah visited the Vanner home and stayed inside for less than an hour. When he emerged, he was carrying a single jar, the largest anyone had seen, swirling not with blue, but with an iridescent green light. No one saw Ruth again. The field where she'd been found was plowed under that autumn, but in the right light, the soil there still catches the sun in a way that makes it glint like water. The incident was quietly referred to as the overdraw. Among the Dreadmoores' unseen clientele, it caused unrest. Overdrawn debts risked contamination, and contamination meant the thing behind the mouth could taste something it was never meant to taste. The thing behind the door is patient, but it is not merciful. After the overdraw, something shifted in the rhythm of the debts. The collections became more frequent, more brutal. The jars began to glow with new colors, fiery reds, deep purples, sickly yellows, colors that no one could name and few dared to describe. More unsettling were the disappearances. Not just debtors now, but their families, wives, children, neighbors. No reason given, no debts recorded, just vanished, as if erased from existence. Townsfolk whispered of a spreading hunger, an appetite that no ledger could satisfy. Among those lost was Reverend Alcott's widow, a woman of quiet faith and sharp eyes. She was last seen in the orchard, speaking softly to the wind. When she returned days later, her voice was hollow, her steps hesitant. She spoke of voices calling her name from beneath the earth, of shadows that licked at her heels. Within weeks, she too vanished, leaving behind only a faint echo of cold air. The Dreadmoores tightened their grip. Lucinda was seen less often in public, her once pale face now marked with deep lines, eyes that darted as if fearing something unseen. Jeremiah grew quieter, speaking only in murmurs, often staring at the black door as if expecting it to open of its own accord. Whispers spread that the thing behind the door was growing restless, that the jars were not enough, that it demanded more than memories and shadows, that it hungered for essence. It was said that the last time Jeremiah was seen alive, he carried with him a carved box no larger than child's toy. Inside, according to rumor, was a fragment of his own soul, offered in hopes of appeasement. But no one truly knows what happened after that night. The legacy of the Dreadmoores is not one of wealth or honor. It is a curse, one that stains every generation born into the name. After Jeremiah's disappearance, the estate fell silent. Lucinda vanished within a fortnight, leaving only a locked diary behind, its pages filled with arcane symbols and desperate pleas for forgiveness. No heir stepped forward to claim the estate, and rumors grew that the family line was ending, not by death, but by erasure. Those few who bore the Dreadmoore name after 1825 were marked by a strange pallor and a peculiar stillness. Neighbors claimed their voices had lost warmth. Their eyes reflected an endless shadow, as if something vital had been siphoned away before birth. Some spoke in whispers of the empty children, offspring who existed only as echoes, hollow vessels for whatever hunger had claimed their ancestors. The estate itself decayed rapidly. By 1830, the once grand manor was little more than a ruin, vines strangling its timbers, windows staring blank and unseeing like the hollow eyes of the missing. Yet on certain nights, the faint glow of candlelight flickered behind the boarded east wing, and a low, rhythmic tapping echoed through the orchard, a sound some said was the heartbeat of the thing beneath. Local folk dared not enter the grounds, but the legend of the Dreadmoores spread beyond Allegheny County, whispered in taverns, churches, and secret societies. Some claimed that descendants of the family survived in shadows, moving quietly through the corridors of power, their faces unreadable, their motives inscrutable. The greatest tragedy, however, was not the physical ruin or vanished souls. It was the knowledge, the forbidden truth, that the debts collected by the Dreadmoores were still owed, that somewhere behind that black door the hunger waited, and that the cost of that hunger was far from paid. Though the Dreadmoore estate lies in ruin, their legacy refuses to die. In towns scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia, tales persist of sudden disappearances, inexplicable tragedies, and strange symbols. Crescent moons bisected by arrows, etched into hidden corners. Some dismiss these as superstition, but those who look deeper know better. Whispers tell of secret societies tracing their lineage back to the Dreadmoores, groups wielding influence behind closed doors, pulling strings in politics, finance, and religion. These descendants carry with them an ancient burden, the knowledge that the hunger behind the black door still demands payment. Modern technology has yet to expose the full extent of this influence, but unexplained patterns of disappearances and financial collapses align disturbingly with old maps marking Dreadmoore territories. Those who probe too close find themselves ostracized, threatened, or worse, erased from public memory, their stories quietly scrubbed from records. Psychologists who study these cases describe a phenomenon resembling collective trauma, passed down through generations, manifesting as nightmares, sudden amnesia, or compulsive behaviors linked to the ancestral curse. The East Wing's black door may have been boarded up, but it's never fully closed. The debt remains unpaid, and the hunger, eternal. The Dreadmoore legacy is not just physical, it's psychological. This is a story of control deeper than laws or contracts, of an influence that invades the mind and shapes reality itself. The family's methods created more than relics. They forged systems of obedience through fear, memory manipulation, and the slow erosion of identity. Those who owed, the Dreadmoores were trapped in an unending cycle of debt, not just financial, but existential. Memories were harvested to strip away personal will, leaving hollow shells susceptible to suggestion and control. This fragmentation fractured communities, isolating individuals who once trusted each other, turning neighbors into strangers haunted by forgotten ties. Even the descendants bear the scars, subconscious chains manifesting as compulsions, nightmares, and an inexplicable sense of dread that colors their every decision. The whispered chants during the gathering nights were more than ritual. They were psychological warfare, weaving belief into the fabric of the victims' minds until resistance became impossible. Modern psychology calls this trauma bonding and memory suppression, but the Dreadmoores weaponized it centuries ago, long before science named the phenomena. Understanding this manipulation is key, not just to uncovering the past, but to breaking free from its grip. The truth behind the Dreadmoores could never have survived without powerful allies. From the earliest days, the family cultivated relationships with influential figures, ministers, magistrates, wealthy landowners, weaving a protective cloak of silence and complicity. Bribes, blackmail, and carefully placed rumors ensured that questions went unanswered and investigations died before they began. Churches across the region benefited from the sacred relics, their congregations swelled by whispered tales of miracles, even as the foundation beneath those relics was drenched in blood and deceit. The clergy who accepted the Dreadmore's gifts became gatekeepers of a lie that extended beyond faith into control and power. Local officials, many indebted themselves, turned a blind eye to disappearances, dismissing them as frontier misfortunes or accidents. Court records were altered or sealed, and families who dared to speak out found themselves ruined or vanished. This network of institutional corruption was not accidental. It was deliberate, a fortress built to protect the family's legacy and the dark entity that fed from it. The weight of silence, the fear of reprisal, and the allure of power combined to bury the truth beneath layers of accepted history. But no fortress is impenetrable forever. Truth is dangerous. The Dreadmoore curse thrives in shadows, feeding on ignorance and fear. But once you see beyond the veil, you can never unsee. The knowledge of their dark history is a double-edged sword. It burdens the soul, but also arms it with power. Awareness awakens resistance. The family shattered by memory loss and spiritual erosion begin to reclaim fragments of themselves. Whispers of rebellion grow louder in forgotten corners and quiet towns as those who remember start to speak. This is the real threat to the Dreadmore's centuries-old dominion. The awakening of awareness in their descendants, in those linked by blood, by debt, by memory. But the price is high. To know the truth is to invite darkness into your mind, to risk losing pieces of your own identity in struggle. The transformation is painful, isolating, and permanent. Yet it is necessary, because only by understanding the machinery of control can one hope to dismantle it. This awakening is the first step in breaking free. Symbols are not just marks, they are vessels of power. The crescent moon bisected by an arrow, the recurring sigil etched into the Dreadmoore estate's black door, carved into relics, and hidden in the margins of family documents. This was no mere family crest. It was a sigil of binding, a code, to communicate with the entity behind the door. Ancient texts, some buried in private collections and forbidden archives, reveal this symbol's origins trace back to dark pacts made in Europe centuries before the family crossed the Atlantic. It represented the binding of a soul to a force that promised power in exchange for sacrifice. For the Dreadmoores, this symbol was both a warning and a promise, to themselves and to those who dared cross their path. It was a mark of ownership, an unbreakable contract inscribed in blood and memory. The rituals performed during the gathering nights echoed these ancient rites, not just to honor tradition, but to renew the bond and sustain the entity's hunger. The chants, the circles in the orchard, the offerings of memory and flesh, all were part of an elaborate system to keep the pact alive across generations. Understanding these symbols is to glimpse the architecture of the curse itself, the framework holding the entire dark enterprise together. The Dreadmoores mastered more than dark rituals. They wielded psychological terror with surgical precision. From childhood, Their heirs and debtors alike were subjected to subtle conditioning. Fear was never overtly stated. It was whispered in the spaces between words, embedded in silence, and locked in a family lore as truths never to be questioned. The slow erosion of memory served a purpose beyond theft. It fractured identity, disoriented will, and fostered dependence. Victims became malleable, obedient, unable to trust their own minds or memories. This psychological fragmentation prevented rebellion and ensured loyalty through terror masked as faith. Even the family's own children were raised in this crucible of control. Lucinda's journals speak of lessons in silence, of the value of fear as a tool more powerful than chains or blades. The constant presence of the Black Door was a reminder that some truths were too dangerous to face. Modern studies on trauma bonding and dissociative identity disorder echo these mechanisms, revealing how prolonged fear and memory suppression can rewrite the very sense of self. The Dreadmore's cruelty anticipated these findings centuries ahead of their time. To understand their control is to recognize how deeply power can corrupt not only flesh but mind and soul. The Dreadmoores were not isolated specters, but architects of influence woven through political and religious institutions. Documents uncovered in fragmented archives reveal how the family's wealth and arcane knowledge bought them seats at local councils, and secret handshakes granted them access to church hierarchies hungry for power. Their relics were not mere artifacts, but tools of manipulation, miracles that swelled congregations and swayed votes. Political candidates endorsed by the Dreadmoores found unusual success. Laws favorable to their interests passed quietly, and dissenters faced ruin through sudden scandals or mysterious disappearances. Religious leaders who resisted were marginalized or disappeared entirely. This network operated with chilling efficiency, a symbiotic system where power protected darkness and darkness sustained power. The whispered crescent and arrow sigil marked not just the family, but their influence, an invisible brand on those complicit in their secret. Understanding this is to see how the Dreadmore's curse transcended the personal, becoming a force shaping communities and nations from the shadows. In the late 20th century, advances in archival research and forensic science began to peel back the veil, concealing the Dreadmore's dark past. Historians sifting through neglected county records noticed discrepancies, missing death certificates, odd patterns of disappearances, and references to unexplained illnesses clustered near the ruins of the estate. Local folklore, once dismissed as superstition, gained new relevance as researchers connected symbols in faded letters to the crescent and arrow sigil. Forensic analysis of soil samples from the orchard site revealed traces of human biological material preserved far beyond natural decay, signs consistent with early preservation techniques described in the family's journals. Archaeologists found fragments of ornate boxes carved with the sigil, their interiors coated with a substance resembling aged, embalming resin. These discoveries forced a reckoning within academic circles. How much of history had been shaped or hidden to protect a secret too dangerous to confront? But as knowledge spread, so did resistance. Those who sought the truth faced intimidation, threats to careers, funding, and personal safety. It became clear that the Dreadmore's legacy was protected not just by history, but by living networks unwilling to let the past fully emerge. Confronting the Dreadmoore legacy is not without consequence. Researchers, journalists, and whistleblowers who probed too deeply found their lives unraveling with terrifying consistency. Careers dismantled, reputations smeared, and in some cases, bodies discovered under suspicious circumstances. One historian who published a paper linking the Dreadmoores to unexplained disappearances received anonymous threats and was forced into exile. A journalist's investigation was shut down after his computer was wiped clean. His notes, sources, and evidence vanished as if erased by unseen hands. Local communities experienced renewed waves of disappearances, coinciding eerily with moments when the family's history was brought into public discussion. It was as if the curse, or whatever power sustains it, reached out to silence those who dared to shine light into the darkness. Even today, the shadow lingers. Social media groups dedicated to exposing the truth find themselves infiltrated and dismantled. Accounts disappear. Posts are scrubbed. The hunger for silence remains as ravenous as ever. To engage with this history is to step into a battlefield where knowledge is both weapon and target, and where every revelation carries a risk. Those who have come face to face with the Dreadmoore truth often find themselves haunted long after the facts are uncovered. The psychological toll is profound. Nightmares that blur the line between memory and nightmare. A creeping paranoia that shadows every step, and an overwhelming sense of isolation from those who remain unaware. Survivors and researchers alike describe a lingering dread, a whisper at the edge of perception, a gnawing void where certainty once lived. Some develop dissociative symptoms, struggling to hold onto their sense of self as fragmented memories resurface in distorted waves. This is not simply fear. It is the echo of the curse itself, transmitted through bloodlines and consciousness. The slow unraveling of identity mirrors the same process inflicted on the debtors centuries ago. Yet in this darkness, some find resolve. The knowledge they carry becomes a crucible, forging resilience and a fierce determination to break the cycle. But the path forward is perilous, fraught with unseen dangers and relentless forces determined to keep the past buried. At the heart of the Dreadmoore legacy lies a complex web of power, an unyielding force that bends individuals and institutions alike to its will. This power is not merely financial or political. It operates through fear, loyalty, and a calculated exploitation of human weakness. The family's ability to manipulate memory and identity gave them unparalleled leverage, a form of control that transcended traditional boundaries. Those caught in their web found themselves trapped by invisible chains, debts that could never be repaid, secrets that could never be revealed, and a terror so deep it paralyzed resistance before it could begin. The Dreadmoores wielded this power not just for survival, but as a weapon to extend their influence, to shape communities, silence dissent, and maintain the insidious hunger behind the Black Door. Understanding these dynamics is crucial. It reveals how corruption is not chaos, but order, a deliberate architecture designed to perpetuate itself. To confront this power is to face the very essence of manipulation, and to claim the strength to resist. No great evil operates alone. Within the Dreadmoore enterprise, individuals played precise roles, from the architects of deception to the enforcers of silence. Each was bound by fear, ambition, or a twisted sense of duty. Jeremiah and Lucinda Dreadmoore were the family's core, the masterminds who orchestrated collections, maintained the estate's facade, and negotiated with powerful allies. Their ruthlessness was matched only by an unwavering belief in their divine mission to sustain the entity behind the door. Apprentices and servants operated in the shadows, some knowingly complicit, others trapped by circumstance and threat. Their silence was purchased with promises of safety or threatened with destruction. Local officials, clergy, and merchants formed a broader network, unwitting or complicit, enforcing the system's rules and protecting its secrets. Each bore a mark of the crescent and arrow sigil, a silent oath binding them to the cause. Understanding these roles is key to unraveling the machinery of control. It shows how power is dispersed yet concentrated, a network that can only be dismantled by exposing every link. The line between victim and perpetrator in the Dreadmoore saga is thin, almost non-existent. Many caught in the web of debt and memory theft became unwilling collaborators, their fractured minds manipulated into enforcing the very system that enslaved them. Some apprentices, once innocent, became adept at the cruel arts of preservation and collection. Others acted out of fear, believing their compliance would spare their families or themselves. This cycle of complicity extended deeper. Families torn apart by loss saw members turn on each other, whispering accusations and wielding suspicion as a weapon. The entity behind the door thrived on this chaos, feeding not just on memories, but on fractured loyalties and broken trust. Even the Dreadmoores themselves were trapped in this cycle. Their belief in a divine purpose was both their armor and their prison, blinding them to the monstrous reality they upheld. To break free, one must first recognize how easily the chains of oppression can become chains of self. Rituals were not mere ceremony for the Dreadmoores. They were contracts etched in blood and spirit. Each gathering night was a dark symphony. Chants whispered in forgotten tongues, circles drawn in the orchard soil, offerings of memory, flesh, and bone laid before the black door. These acts renewed the bond with the entity, binding new souls to the endless hunger. The rituals served multiple purposes. They reinforced control within the family, ensured the community's silence, and most terrifyingly, they wove the debtor's essence into the very fabric of the curse. Lucinda's journals describe a particular rite, the Night of Veils, where identities blurred and the boundaries between living and dead thinned. Participants spoke of losing time, voices not their own, and a cold presence watching from the shadows. These rites were both spiritual and psychological weapons, tools of domination crafted to perpetuate the cycle beyond death. Understanding them is to glimpse the architecture of the eternal hunger itself. The Dreadmoore curse did not end with crumbling estates and faded relics. It evolved, adapting to new times and technologies. Today, descendants report strange dreams, sudden blackouts, and unexplainable losses, moments when memories vanish or emotions fracture without cause. Some find themselves drawn inexplicably to forgotten places tied to the family's dark past, as if the curse itself is pulling them home. In urban legends and online forums, stories circulate of mysterious symbols appearing on doors, mirrors fogging to reveal hidden messages, and eerie voices whispering in the dead of night. These are dismissed by many, but for those who know the signs, they are reminders that the entity's hunger remains unquenched. Even modern institutions show cracks, the same patterns of control, silence, and erasure playing out in corporate boardrooms and political offices, echoing the family's centuries-old methods. The past is not past. It lives in shadows, feeding, waiting. Resistance begins with knowledge, but it demands courage beyond measure. Individuals connected to the Dreadmoore legacy have begun to awaken, forging paths to break the curse's hold. Through research, ritual unbinding, and community solidarity, they push back against centuries of silence and manipulation. Secret gatherings exchange forbidden knowledge, using symbols once meant to bind now to empower. Psychologists work to heal the fractured minds left in the curse's wake, while historians uncover truths buried beneath lies. But every act of defiance invites retaliation, threats, erasures, and a persistent, suffocating fear. The hunger behind the black door senses the shift, responding with subtle cruelty designed to fracture resolve. Yet, amid this darkness, sparks of light grow, proof that no curse is absolute, and that even the deepest shadows can be pierced. Breaking the Dreadmoore curse demands more than bravery. It demands sacrifice. Those who seek to sever the bond risk losing more than memories. They risk their very essence. Families fractured beyond repair, lives uprooted, identities shattered. Some who attempt the ritual of unbinding vanish without a trace, swallowed by the hunger they sought to escape. The curse fights back, not with open violence, but with slow, creeping erosion, fracturing trust, sowing doubt, and isolating the brave from those they love. The unbinding is not a moment, but a war waged within the soul, where every victory demands a toll. Yet for those who endure, the price is worth the freedom to reclaim self, to rewrite the story bound to their blood. The darkest chains can break, but only for those willing to face the abyss and walk through fire. The black door is more than a barrier. It is a threshold between worlds. Behind it lies the source of the hunger, an entity neither fully human nor entirely other. It is a force of consumption and control, ancient beyond reckoning, bound to the Dreadmoore bloodline through a pact sealed in desperation and ambition. Those who glimpsed behind the door spoke of a darkness that whispered promises of power and immortality, but at the cost of endless sacrifice. It feeds not on flesh alone, but on memory, identity, and the very soul itself. The rituals, the relics, the disappearances, all threads woven into a tapestry of binding, designed to sustain this insatiable force. The family's legacy is a conduit, a prison, and a weapon, forged in shadows and kept alive by silence. Understanding this is to stand face to face with a primordial hunger, one that defies reason and demands eternal vigilance. You have walked through shadows few dare enter. You have faced truths that shatter illusions and unravel comfortable lies. But now, the choice is yours, to retreat into ignorance, allowing the hunger to remain unchallenged, or to rise as the keeper of forbidden knowledge, armed with awareness, resilience, and the will to break cycles centuries old. This is no mere story. It is a summons. The darkness behind the black door seeks to claim those who falter, but it fears those who stand unwavering in the light of truth. Embrace this power. Let the symbols, the history, and the warnings become your armor. And remember, knowledge is not just power. It is transformation. If you are ready to claim your destiny, comment below the phrase, "The shadow yields to light," twice. Let this be your declaration and your bond with the truth you now carry. Subscribe and step forward, because this is only the beginning.